Hey, everybody, this is Tony Paquin, and today is our first ever episode of the Supply Side Podcast. Wanted to take a couple minutes first, talk about why this is an important subject to me, what we're going to be talking about in the months to come, the years to come, potentially. A very serious issue, something that I'm very passionate about. That is the global or the globalization of the medical supply chain and how it affects all of our lives on a daily basis. A very critical conversation. Before we get into that, I'll give you just a little bit of my background and hey, how did I end up in this place? Why do I even care? And I have a background in technology and in healthcare, but really, I grew up, as they now call it, in the Rust Belt, back in Detroit, Michigan, and Flint, Michigan, at a time when those were great cities to be from, and at a time when the automotive industry was booming. So I was really in a front row seat, if you will, on how great this country can be when we have a manufacturing base, when everybody has a great job and they're producing and creating value for the good of the country. My father was a Depression era child who grew up on the streets of Detroit, ended up in the army during World War II, came back and hired into General Motors as somebody working in the factory, but worked his way up into a senior leadership position. So I was able to be kind of a part of that and watch that process take place. Now, it just so happened my age when I was born and when I came up as a young man in Flint was right during this era when things started to move overseas. So a production of cars was going first to Toyota, of course, many years later, and ended up in China. But this was really the beginning of this globalization thing. And all of a sudden, jobs started going overseas, and we were able to get, you know, products cheaper and cheaper and faster, and everything seemed to be working out. So it was a time where I saw the transition from a world where we made everything to a world where, gee, as it turns out, we don't make anything. But I grew up and got off into business and ended up in the technology industry. I was in the software business, very active. I started now three companies. Two of those were very successful startups in the software business, one in the insurance industry. Formed a company with my brother Gary. It went on to produce software for the independent insurance market. Became a pretty big deal. That business is still around today. It's worth a couple $1 billion and obviously doing very well. So, the joke in our family is maybe I sold it a little early. I sold it to a group of insurance companies, really controlled by CNA Insurance, and learned a lot from them. Had a great run, wonderful people, great experience. But from there, by the way, I was involved with the industry. I formed the Arizona Software Association and then later the Idaho Technology Association. I've always been kind of involved with public policy, working with governors and senators and congressmen and leaders at both the state and national level. As I went into my second software company, there was an electronic medical record business software application for the healthcare world, and ended up building that up and taking that public on the NASDAQ. So I had a little bit of experience with the public company world. In that era in my life, I also ran for U.S. Congress and I wrote a book. So there's, a lot of activity going on, met a lot of interesting people, really developed an admiration for leaders. It doesn't matter if they're on the left or the right or they're entrepreneurs or with large corporations. There's some really great people out there and learned a lot from a lot of really good people. Uh, Fortunately, probably it's a good thing that I did not win that election. That kept me in business, probably a better place for me to be. But I ended up doing consulting work in the hospital market. I worked with about 600 hospitals coast to coast, mostly working with senior executives, C level, C suite, CEOs, CFOs, board members. And as a result, worked with the greatest hospitals in the country, and learned a lot about the industry as I was doing that. The nature of what we were doing, we were holding conferences, and I would have hospital seniors, leadership people come to our conference, typically CEOs, sometimes senior vice presidents. We'd get 300 to 400 a year come to these conferences that we were holding. And the initiative was we were building businesses with those hospitals. We would build pharmacies or DME stores or urgent care centers, doctors' offices, primary care, gift shops, just all kinds of different enterprises that we would work with these hospitals to help them generate revenue because they were all in need of margin and better ways to operate their companies. So we did that for many years, probably about 5 to 10 years. And in the process, we would buy a lot of medical supplies. Like, we would build a pharmacy. The pharmacy might be doing $100 million a year. Well, we have to buy all the drugs or all the supplies to operate that business. In that process, we realized, geez, this medical supply industry just has not modernized. And it's still kind of being run like it's the late 20th century or something. Now, remember, I grew up in a supply chain driven kind of world in the automotive industry. I actually sold manufacturing and supply chain management software way back in the 80s. Now, I'm a high tech guy, had run two very successful technology software companies. And naturally, I thought, geez, there's got to be a better way. Let's develop some technology to help solve this problem that was clearly happening in the medical supply chain. So we did that. And that's how we ended up with what we run today, which is called iRemedy Healthcare. iRemedy is a completely new platform, supply chain management platform for the medical supply industry. We've developed a AI based technology. Now, of course, everybody today is talking artificial intelligence. We're going to spend some time talking about that. A lot of people misunderstand even those terms. But we began to develop this AI approach to solving this large, complex problem in healthcare about 4 or 5 years ago. And, is there a problem? Yeah, there's a problem. It's a disaster. It's amazing, really, first off, how expensive everything is, but then really that we have shortages of such a critical thing. We all experienced this in the pandemic, and at iRemedy, we're very much on the front line. Someday we'll be talking about that. We were one of the largest suppliers to the U.S. government during Operation Warp Speed and during the pandemic. And what a horrible time that was for this country in many ways, not just, the disease, which was terrible, and the people that died and suffered as a result of that, but then you also had the shutdown and the economics and the political aspects as well. So a very, very difficult time in our history. But everybody during that time found out about the shortage problem. Hey, we couldn't get this, we couldn't get that. Of course, it hit all areas of our lives as consumers, but it particularly hit the healthcare world really well. What you may not know and realize is that that shortage problem has been going on for decades. There's just a problem. Doctors, hospitals, caregivers, patients, they can't get the stuff they need to take care of their patients reliably. And it's an amazing thing. But, we'll talk a little bit more. We'll get into this in detail. But I mean, even today, if you simply go Google cancer drug shortages, for example, you're probably going to see that there's some sort of crises in that area. That's ridiculous. Here we are, the greatest country in the world, the most powerful nation on earth. We can do amazing things, but we can't reliably get the drugs we need to take care of our children, members of our family who are in dire, health circumstances. So it's a huge problem, and it's shocking when you get into it and you get the exposure that my team and I have had, really running on the front lines of this globalization problem. So just like the automotive industry, practically every other industry went overseas for its primary manufacturing. So did healthcare. And probably 80% of the drugs and medical devices and supplies you need and you use every day, probably made in Asia, most likely in China. And that's obviously a crisis. So we're beginning to experience it now, but we're really on the front end of this problem. It's going to go from serious to catastrophic sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, depending on how we manage that situation. This is such a passionate area for me, and coming out of this experience with OWS and the pandemic and COVID, we actually are writing a book on this, and just so happens we're very close to wrapping that up. But this is this is an amazing story of the craziness that takes place in the medical supply industry. You think it's like this perfect modern, America on top of the world, got everything under control kind of circumstance, and it's the exact opposite. And we lived it, and we've taken that experience, and we're using that experience to illustrate the frailty of the supply chain and what it represents as a national defense issue. That book will hopefully be out sometime this summer. We'll see, but it's going to be really, really good. Tons of content, super exciting stuff going on there. Another thing that we did, as had the opportunity to join with the guys that formed a coalition of medical supply, drug, and other suppliers of medical supplies, manufacturers, and distributors here in the United States. And it's called the SAMS Coalition. And Anthony, if you could bring that up, or Sakshi on a screen share, maybe we'll take a look at that in a moment. To look at their website, people could get the spelling of that. But SAM's coalition, as I mentioned, is a coalition of pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers of drugs and devices, who are trying to get that done here in the United States. And it's the reshoring process. So, okay. Turns out we can't screen share, Anthony. So I'm going to bring that up on, Sam's Coalition. I'm just going to, samscoalition.org is the URL. And there it is right now. We can see that. So just using that to emphasize again, securing America's medicine and supply. The SAMS guys are great guys, and they got a great message, and they're very passionately in touch with our elected leaders in Washington D.C. I serve on the board of directors with SAMS. They are a great source of information. But just bringing them up, we're going to talk a lot about them. I think we'll get David Sanders, their director, over to meet with us. And these guys are really on the front line of understanding what do we need to do as a country to domesticate our medical supply manufacturing. Some people call this reshoring. Others call it friend shoring when they move it to a country that's a friendly country. I've now heard the latest term is to de-risk. This is the idea that we're at great risk because of China. They want to begin to minimize this risk. I was actually on a call with a certain administration member on the National Security Council from the White House, and we were talking about iRemedy and everything that iRemedy does. And one of our goals as a company is we're trying to build what we describe as the largest and smartest medical supply catalog in the world. That's part of what we're working on here at iRemedy. We've got this AI powered technology, does some super cool stuff there. But anyhow, in this phone call with this NIC guy, he says to me, "Yeah, and Mr. Paquin, I appreciate that introduction. Someday here in the White House, we believe someday soon that 90% of those products that you have available on your site, will be domestically manufactured." Well, that's an absurd concept. And I told him that, by the way. I said, well, that's, pretty much a stupid idea. You can't do that. We carry about, somewhere in the neighborhood of a million products. You're telling me 90% of those are going to be made in America or are currently. No, it's about the other way around. You'd be lucky to have 10% of those items made in America. That's just foolish. It's an extremely serious and complex problem. And the fact is, the great majority of all these products are caught up in the globalization movement. And if we want to reshore those products or domesticate that supply, that's a long-term commitment that we as a country have to make at the level of government, as consumers, and in the commercial side of the business, the manufacturers and distributors. So we can't solve this we can't solve this problem tomorrow, but we can begin to work on solving the problem. And that's something that definitely, absolutely has to happen. Yeah, I mentioned in passing China a couple of times. China is just an extremely important part of this discussion because that's where all your drugs and supplies are coming from for all practical purposes. Without China, we have no supply. And yeah, that's a very risky place for us to be because we're also getting into world conflict with China. And we'll talk more in the months to come about the geopolitical implications. But for example, China is going to want to take Taiwan. And while they're doing that, they are going to have total and complete control over our pharmaceutical industry for all practical purposes. Now, you could get into a debate where somebody's going to go, no, they don't have control over our industry. Well, maybe not in absolute legal terms, they don't, but as a practical matter, they control the supply chain, they control the raw materials, and they've got the great technology and manufacturing base that is required in order to produce the products that we need. A lot of people are sophisticated now know that in China, when we talk about manufacturing, we're not talking about some upstart third world nation that is, making plastic toys. They are very sophisticated. They have great technology and they're very good at what they do in many regards. And we are dependent upon that. So China is a very big part of the supply chain conversation. And our job in this country is to figure out how to de-risk that, move things into friendly nations, move things into the United States, but also know how we're going to manage the China supply chain, if you will, in the years to come. So that's something that's very very important. The other thing that I just want to talk about again is to realize that this issue is very personal. In the world today, in the United States, everybody is probably 1 or 2 degrees of separation at most from this problem in a life and death way. That's because very likely you either work in healthcare or you have a family member or a close friend that is in the healthcare system. You have a mother, a father, an aunt, an uncle, a child, a sister, a brother, or a good friend who unfortunately is interacting with this system in some way. And it's challenging because in some ways we do brilliant things in healthcare. We have great inventions and great caregivers, great doctors, great hospitals. But in other ways, we have this antiquated system and we suffer. And so, the supply chain is one of those. If you, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk a little bit of the podcast, if you were to just go out and uh, Google cancer drug shortages. I just did this morning as we're getting ready to go online. It just shows you that this is a look. This is June 12th. Pretty recent article of this year. It was just somebody talking about the fact that they're multi-care, a big healthcare center, cancer center in the Seattle area, and here's a lady, and she just flat out cannot get the drugs that she needs to continue the treatment required by her cancer. So, yeah, this is not an unusual circumstance, or, this is not unheard of. This is the kind of thing that's happening in our world. And again, very likely impacts you much more closely than you think. Those are the subjects that we're going to be talking about. We have a lot of experience in this area, a lot of background. We have contacts all over the world. We've, over the last couple of years, my team and I have imported over 1 billion items into the United States as part of our healthcare work. So we've had real frontline experiences working with the government, working with our friends at the SAMS Coalition, helping new startup manufacturers here in the United States. We're very interested in talking to people who are either planning to or have already started domestic manufacturing. There's a ton of challenges with that. We're actually going to do some things to help them every way that we can. But that'll be our discussion going forward is we're going to take a look at this medical supply chain. We're going to bring in people we know that are absolute experts. We're going to have a very open conversation about what do we need to do as a country to improve the supply chain. So again, thank you for taking some time with us today. My name is Tony Paquin, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again on the next episode of The Supply Side.